listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
Hello and welcome along to the Straight to Video podcast. First up, wow, what an incredible response to our last episode with the legendary Malcolm Alurad from Showaddywaddy. Now I know that guy is a real rock and roll legend, but so many people checked out that chat, and to be honest, I was a little blown away with the feedback and particularly the download numbers, so thank you so much. Hopefully if you've enjoyed that talk, you've decided to stick around and check out a few more episodes, including today's, which was a really great chat as I checked in with Marty Rifkin. Now Marty is a music producer based out in California, but also a world-renowned multi-instrumentalist, perhaps best known for his pedal steel guitar playing on Tom Petty's incredible Wildflowers album. And he's also worked several times with Bruce Springsteen on his Ghost of Tom Joad LP, and also touring with the boss in his Sessions band during 2006. Marty's other production and session credits are pretty endless, and also include working on the Superman Man of Steel soundtrack with Hans Zimmer. Now, I became aware of Marty when I was on holiday in Hollywood back around, I think it was like 2012, 2013 time, and I went to catch a live in-store appearance with Chris Shiflett of the Foo Fighters at the world-famous Amoeba Music. Now, Chris was promoting his new country album with his band The Dead Peasants, and I'm always drawn to animated performers on stage, and particularly people who are obviously having a great time. And so whilst a pedal steel guitar player has to perform sitting down, Marty was still incredibly animated, and the joy he showed whilst playing was just the best and so much fun to watch. So for me, he summed up the live performance feeling, and I've been a fan ever since. During this great chat, Marty speaks of his move to California in the late 70s and takes us through his whole journey over several decades. His time working with both Tom Petty and Bruce Springsteen, but he shares so many more cool memories along the way. I really hope you enjoy this chat and maybe track down some of Marty's work. You can find a list of his albums at martyrifkin.com, where I think you'll be blown away by everyone he's worked with. But for now, sit back and enjoy my straight to video talk with Marty Rifkin. Are you a California kid, born and raised?
I'm from Baltimore originally, and I always wanted to come to California. I love the music of California. This is in the 70s, so in 78, I got this van, big giant maxi van, and loaded it up with, shag carpeting and the bed and refrigerator and all that, and my gear. And I moved to California and lived in my van for about a year and a half here in Santa Monica.
That's awesome. Just on your own?
Just on my own. And it was before the whole homeless thing, so living in your van was okay. And I joined the Santa Monica Y so I could take a shower, and I took a sauna every day just because I could, so I didn't feel like I was just living in this little box. And it was such a great year.
Is that stuff you kind of figured out once you got into California about like where you can get yourself clean and places to park and all that kind of stuff? Was you kind of working on the fly?
I was working on the fly. I had a friend who came out here once before, and there was a big DJ in Baltimore who had a condo, and there was a parking lot in the back, Joe Bucheri, and a friend of mine had spent a month or two in his parking lot. And so he told me about it, and Joe said, yeah, park here. And it was behind the House of Billiards off of Wilshire Boulevard here in Santa Monica. And they knew me, and I could go in and, wash up and hang and stuff. It was figuring it out on the fly, like you said.
So prior to that, growing up in Baltimore, what was that like for you? Was you always into music, or did you have other passions?
Oh, I don't remember before. Before we were a bunch of kids. We were a bunch of kids playing. It was a neighborhood, tons of kids. We were always out and having fun. And one day when I was about 14, my friend Cliff said, we need a bass player for this, our band. And his older brother handed me a bass. And that night I went home and it kind of made sense to me. So then once I started playing, then that became a passion.
What kind of music was you listening to like recognize the bass? Because I'm a bass player, but my knowledge prior, before I was kind of getting into music seriously, I wouldn't have been able to like really pick the bass out as such. It was something you kind of have to train your ears to own in on.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because back in those days too, there was a lot of transistor stuff. And it's funny, my wife now, Mona, she was also my high school girlfriend. And she's always proud that I was able to teach her how to pick out the bass part on a transistor radio. You can kind of hear it. But no, I think I heard it right away when I first got the bass that he lent me. That night I went home and I learned the bass part to Hey Joe with one finger on two strings. So it was a lot of extra work I probably didn't need to do. And so I think back then I was listening more to stuff like that. The first band we did some Grand Funk. We did Jethro Tull, as only a trio of 14 and, 13, 14, and 15-year-olds could do. And then later on, once I hit around 17 or so, and I was really serious, then I started listening more to that California country rock-ish, Eagles, Poco, James Taylor, that whole Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. And, I love the bass in those songs because it was kind of just playing the song with cool movement and not necessarily just, riff-based, which is pretty great too. But, I kind of gravitated to that.
Before that bass was kind of thrown into your lap and told we need a bass player, had you envisioned being in a band at any point?
Not at all. That's what I mean. It wasn't like, I didn't do anything before I was 14, but, we played sports. We were just kids hanging out, and it was suburban, so it wasn't like anything seedy or anything. We would just all hang out and do kickball and junk like that. But once that was in my hand and I fell in love with it, then, I kind of moved into the basement in my home, and, my mother, my sister, my brother, it's like, there he is, boom, 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 down there, lifting the needle. And of course, I didn't know anything about, vari speed, but a lot of those records were not running at true pitch. They would speed them up a little bit to make it a little more exciting, which you're tuned for one song and then you're out of tune for the next song. And it's sometimes hard to hear the pitch when you're first learning on bass for tuning. Well, you're a bass player. It can be tricky. So I remember when I was in real band, that actually is still together. A lot of the guys still play, a band called Tall in the Saddle. The first thing I did was I saved all my money for one of those Con strobe tuners so that we could all be in tune.
I don't know how common it was or not. I mean, I've lent the occasional song to like a CD or something like that and found out it's not been able to figure out the tuning. Did you ever come across any old records where perhaps the bands have tuned up to each other and it's maybe not in a standard tuning? You ever come across that at all?
I don't think I knew enough to know what that was. It would just be where, if I hit a D with one album and then I play a different song even on the same album and it's in D, but it's just sour. So I think that's what I would, mess around with. Then I started getting into technology. I started learning how to slow down with the extra pennies on top of the needle.
Oh, wow. Right.
To kind of slow the speed down, weigh it down to try to get it to pitch. And if it was moving too fast, maybe I would retune the bass, but I'm sure I didn't do a good job of it.
Was that a common practice? I've never heard of that before, about weighing down the needle.
If you need to slow it down, it kind of makes the vinyl drag a little bit.
Yeah.
Just because, like anything, that kind of friction. If they were tuned up, which I think is more likely that they tuned things up, like I said, to make it sound exciting, I was just out of luck. And so, half my life was tuning up, the other half was playing out of tune.
How long was that band together?
Well, that band is actually, like I said, they're still together, a lot of the guys.
How long was you playing with them?
Well, we started with a couple different things, but maybe I was about 17, and when I was 22, that's when I knew I had a clear path to come to California. I remember at the end of high school, my friends talking about going to college, and I'm like, what are you talking about? We're a band. We're supposed to go to California. And then I tried it, going to college and all, but I always knew that I was just aimed for coming here, and it's been really a great ride this whole time.
So what year was it you came? You say 78?
In 78, I came.
And was that to be a bass player, or had you started playing pedal steel at that point?
I was a bass player, and I didn't really work much when I first got here. I remember I got a day job working somewhere, and I had a lesson. I still look back to the younger me, and I thank me in that. After working there, like recruiting engineers, they called me in the office and said, we want to give you a raise. We want to make you a manager of this section. And I said, thank you. That's really awesome. I need to give you my notice. And they're like, what? I'm like, well, you're going to give me this money. I'm going to get a car like yours. I'm going to want a house like yours and everything. And I'll never play music again. So I quit the job, but then I could focus on music more.
That wasn't scary at that point. You knew that this was kind of like a crossroads in a way. You're either going to go down the straight and normal or...
Exactly. So I don't think I was scared. I mean, I didn't know how it was going to end up. But, and you'll know this as a bass player, to finally get out and meet people, you sit in with bands. And the one problem with bass is when you go sit in with a band, their bass player has to sit down. And I didn't like that. They didn't like that. It just seemed like, okay, you can play a couple songs, but that's it unless you got the gig. But just to meet people, you're going to sit in. And I always loved steel and dobro. And when I was back in Baltimore with that band, I was well known as a bass player, but I did get a steel and everybody's like, well, no, you're a bass player. And so I got rid of the steel. But out here, you can redefine yourself anyway. And I knew a whole lot more about music because it's a very complex instrument. I eventually got one, and then it was great because I learned enough to go sit in with bands, and every time I sat in with a band, I just learned more and more and more.
What kind of attracted to you in the first place? Did you hear it on record or see a show?
I think I heard it more on record. I didn't quite know about it physically. Like I said, a lot of those kind of country rockish records, Poco, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, Jerry Garcia playing. It wasn't until I started really diving in that I learned, all the master players, all those Nashville guys. And pedal steel is kind of tricky because there's a lot of moving parts, but not just in the physicalness, but also understanding the tunings, and it was a language I understood the whole concept of it as soon as I sat behind it. It just made sense. So I think I was more lucky than anything to be able to have had that. It would be like a great basketball player. Somebody puts a basketball in their hand and you see their talent and you go, wow, it's a good thing they put a basketball in their hand.
Do you remember where you got your first one from? I wouldn't imagine it's something you can just walk into a store and pick it off the shelf.
The one I got in Baltimore, I don't recall. It must have been used. It was a little student model thing. I only had it for a week, like I said. And so when I moved here and got one, there was a great store in the Valley. Well, you were just out here, right? A few years ago, I guess.
It'll probably scare me as to how long ago it was. I think it was 2000 and probably 2012.
8 years.
Yeah.
Moving way too fast.
Yeah. Tell me.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy because I think you first reached out to me then, when you were out here.
Yeah, it's when you was playing with Chris Shiflett. You did a show at Amoeba, and I saw you. I think you did like an afternoon show at the Hyatt or whatever the Hyatt's called.
Right. Oh, that was fun. We all liked that. And Chris is just so funny because here he is and, the biggest band in the world and all. And he still looks at me like, I think we can get to bed by 9 o'clock tonight because we played in the afternoon, get home with the family. But there was, in the Valley here, there was a great store called Valley Arts Guitar. And they ended up making great instruments, I think, for Gibson, too. They designed these great things. And they had tons of steels where nobody else had those. I remember I went in and I bought this Showbud Super Pro, got it, and started learning kind of right away. And then I think I got rid of that. And being in Hollywood, I had this little like Toyota pickup with a camper shell on the back to hold my gear. And I must have been on Hollywood Boulevard and I stopped at a red light and I was sitting there and all of a sudden I look in my rearview mirror and it's like, oh no. And you could tell somebody's going to hit you in the back. So this woman hit me and my bumper went down and had to get repaired. And so when they paid me for that, I just took that check and bought an Emmons pedal steel. I figured they're going to hit me again. What's the point?
Was you kind of one of a kind out in Hollywood, or was there a few pedal steel players?
There were were a few. I mean, obviously a whole lot less than other players. There's like a nice community of steel players. We all pretty much know each other. And of course, there's some new ones, younger players coming in, which is pretty awesome because it's such a different kind of instrument. But back then, I don't know how many I knew. The one thing about steel is when you play with somebody, and in the 80s, I was playing with almost every band in Southern California, in LA area, because I was like a journeyman. I wasn't a band member necessarily.
A gun for hire.
Gun for hire, and I played a bunch of instruments. I would have steel, guitar, harmonica, even sax, that kind of stuff. So I would play with just a bunch of different bands, but when you play steel, there's usually not a second steel player. So we never get to play with each other. So it was probably a little harder to meet everybody. You more like hear about everybody.
How did pedal steel translate through the hard rock explosion of the mid to late 80s, early 90s? Where was you swimming in those waters?
I got to skip that, although I did do a session with Ricky Rocket,
Right, you got to tell me about that.
I don't remember much about it, but we did it in a house in Beverly Hills or Hollywood Hills somewhere. And it was really funny because I had a friend, Steve Van Gulder, who's since passed, but he played fiddle on it. And they had this song that obviously wanted the country color to it. And with me, it just went really great and smooth. And with him, it went great. But I remember he took out the fiddle, the violin, and then he took out his bow. And the guy went, "Oh, are you going to do that with that thing?" Like bowing. And Steve goes, "Well, if you want me to, I will." It's the only way you could play it. But he was a great guy. Ricky was very just, gracious. And what I've learned is that actually I've always had a great time with all the artists I've played with, where they're kind of very respectful that you know what you're playing and they're not trying to show you up or anything. You're there for a reason. And I had to learn that early on, that you're cast on records, because it's always the why me and not that person.
I'm going to have to track down which Ricky Rocket album or song you played on.
I don't even know if it was an album. It could have been a demo thing he did. You know what I mean? I have no idea whatever happened with it. But short of that, I wasn't in that world. In the early 80s, probably don't remember, this is probably before your time, but the urban cowboy scene hit real big out here, from the movie. And every strip mall had a country bar. And usually a country bar also meant, some rock, but it was more like Skynyrd, that kind of stuff. And that was kind of my life until the late 80s, early 90s, when I started getting into the recording. And at that point, everything shifted. My own studio, what I was working on, everything shifted.
Was that kind of a culmination of all the live stuff you'd done? Your name kind of got out there.
I don't know. I've always worn a bunch of different hats. Like I was a player, the live player. We did this show, Ronnie Mac's Barn Dance, that everybody in town used to come to, at the Palomino. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Palomino. And so, we would do that every Tuesday. People probably got to hear me. I don't know if any of the other stuff came from that. But at the same time, I was wearing that hat as a live player, at that point, just a few times a week. And then I started recording just a bunch of demos for people in LA that were going to go to Nashville, because a lot of people in LA just didn't want to do what they did out there. And I was happy to do that. I had great singers, Joey Scarberry, you remember Believe It or Not, I'm Walking?
Probably the greatest TV theme tune ever.
I think so. I agree with you. And so Joey was my singer here for years. He would be in 3 times a week. Buddy Miller, who's the big Americana artist, was a singer. Jeffrey Steele, a big writer. They were all singers. And we would do these songs where the client would come in at 10 a.m. And I'm talking people, new writers, established writers, and then people like Smokey Robinson and Hal David and Rita Coolidge and people like Bobby Hart from Boyce and Hart, all the Monkey stuff. So whenever they needed a song to get translated to Nashville speak, so to speak, so they could send it out, they would come to me and, I'd say to the kids, okay, daddy's going off to work. I'd come into work at 4 blocks, 9 a.m. Client shows up at 10. The track's built by 1:30. The singer shows up. It's mixed by 5 or 6. And then, I just do some odds and ends and head home. And this went on 6 to 7 days a week for years. So that kind of really taught me the whole kind of like the big ears thing, hear everything going on around you. And at the same time, I was doing steel sessions for other people. And I guess because I'd show up and I could hear everything they played and then try to find my spot, it just kind of ballooned.
So where was all the production kind of learning curve for you then?
just wanting to learn, just like even playing these instruments. Once again, it's the different hats thing. I always became friends with engineers, big engineers that I'd work on a record. Even live stuff, the crew were my friends. I love the crew. And so when you're in the studio, you have the producer, you have the artist, you have all the other players, but then you have the engineers. And so we would become friends, and I could pick their brains. And back in the early 2000, I went to Pro Tools, and I remember a lot of them wouldn't. Like, oh, I can't believe you went to the dark side, 2 years later, I get the call. So, Marty, what shortcut do you use for...
Could have told you. I could have told you. So, like late 80s, kind of 90s, was that the time you felt like you was getting real momentum as both a musician and as a producer? Like that whole 10-year, almost 12 years you've been at on the West Coast, things were finally tipping.
Right away, it took about 2 or 3 years, and then I started working all the time live, like we said, in the clubs. During that time, I would do, small sessions. The home studio thing wasn't quite like it is now. It would be on a Tascam or something, but I treated it all the same because I wanted to learn it. I always felt like it was practice for when I have to do it, until I realized, wait, this isn't practice. This is really somebody's song, And by 88, things were going well. And once I moved to the studio in 93, I stopped playing out live a whole lot. It was just too busy. And I don't know if you went there when you were here. During the whole 80s, I also worked at a great music shop called McCabe's Guitar Shop.
I definitely know the name. I'm trying to think if I've been there on it. Whereabouts is it?
It's in Santa Monica. Everybody should look it up. The shows that they had there, they have live shows. It's very small. It's an intimate place. It's acoustic, but everybody has played there and has wanted to in the most intimate setting. It's because it's an acoustic music store. And like I said, look it up. It's called McCabe's Guitar Shop in Santa Monica.
Probably got it on a sticker on a bass case somewhere, something like that.
Good for you. I like that. So I was working there, 5-6 days a week, and then playing clubs every night. So I don't know when I slept. I look back to that. Between all that, you just learn a whole lot. During the day, I remember all the different people I would sit down and play with that came in trying out guitars. Big guitar players you could only dream of. And that was just during the day at the store, and then at night you get to play. So by the early 90s, everything was kind of going well. And then by the mid-90s, in the early 90s, I'd get little things, maybe a radio spot. And it was always like the biggest thing in the world to me. Like, wow. I come home and tell Mona or tell my boys, and meanwhile, it's just a radio spot, some little bumper thing.
But you still had that fire as if someone had told you that when you was a kid.
The same as reading your name on a liner note on an early Eagles record. Like, wow, And then around the mid-90s, things kind of really blew up. I ended up working with Tom Petty and then Bruce. So it kind of like really opened up at that point. That's when I had to just realize, okay, there's a reason, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Let me just do what I can. And
it was 1995, I think, the Wildflowers album, wasn't it?
94, 95, I forget which one. So we must have recorded it a little earlier.
It has like a real aura and mystique about it, in my opinion. Did you spend much time in the studio with Tom and the other musicians, or was it literally come in, work on the song?
It was come in, work on the song, but it was kind of a lot of stuff happened that day when we were doing it. It was with Rick Rubin and, of course, Mike Campbell, but Rick Rubin was great and Tom was just great. And it was actually at Mike Campbell's house, so it wasn't in the studio. It was an overdub. Quite often with steel, it'll be an overdub. Like, what do we need on this? Oh, let's put some steel on. And just a lot of kind of stuff happened in our conversation, especially for, pedal steel is usually full of ambience. It's got reverbs, delays, whatever. And I remember when they were plugging me in, I said, well, I just need a little bit of reverb. And Tom looks at me and goes, reverb? We don't use reverb. and I was like, oh, well, that's different. And they spent about 20 minutes hooking up a reverb while he taught me the song. And as soon as they hit the play button with me on it and I heard the reverb, it just sounded ridiculous because everything else was dry. I mean, really dry. You hear Tom's voice on that record. There's no reverb. So they turned it off and Tom smiled and, we kind of, we had that moment of, okay, we were happy to accommodate, but they would have never used the reverb. They were just doing it for me.
Because it was the song House in the Woods you played on.
Yeah, I played on House in the Woods. It was kind of cool. There's a lot of chord changes to it, a lot of movement.
It almost mimics the lead vocal melody. Yes,
it does. That's a very good catch. And it is brilliantly written like that. And then when it goes to the next section, it just barrels in. And so he was, while they were hooking up the reverb, he was showing me the chords and stuff. And then I remember turning to Rick, Rubin, and I said, okay, when it gets to the 4 chord, do you want me? And he just stopped me. He goes, no, I don't know from that. He goes, first part of the song, play down there. And he points to the low part of the steel. And then he goes, when it gets exciting, go up.
I've actually heard that about Rick Rubin. Apparently he has no musical training as such.
I didn't know if he was clowning with me or not, but that might be the case.
I've heard that before. He just knows what he likes in his head.
And for me, that was so eye-opening because prior to that, producers seemed to be more specific. And I worked with a lot of composers, and back in the day, they were doing the mock-ups, and then, you play, and everything was a little more precise kind of thing. And I thought as a producer, you're supposed to tell everybody what notes to play and, how to do it, because that's what I knew. Unless nobody had a clue, and then you just do whatever. But in this case, he opened my eyes that you can be a stunning producer without saying, play this lick. And since I understood him because he gave me the first taste of it, most of the biggest records I've ever played on have never, ever been specific, not even close to specific. It's more about the aesthetic and how they get along with the artist and how safe the artist feels with them.
Because it's the artist who's the musical one as such, once they're comfortable in their space to create. I think I heard the Rick Rubin thing when it was something to do with Beastie Boys or something like that. I think they explained, there's no technical knowledge, but it's what he does elsewhere where the magic is created.
Yeah, well, and in fact, I went back to them after working with them. And of course, we were still on tape then. But the kind of stuff with Tom, was very organic. Then you hear the Beastie Boys and you hear these edits and these choices and the drum machines, but doing this magical oblong stuff and then going away and coming back. And it's like a marvel to me. And, for him to kind of just do it, like I said, just from his gut feeling, as opposed to having it all planned out. It's just amazing.
Where do you translate that into your role as a producer? Notes and all that kind of thing. Did you take any of that on board, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's funny, sometimes people say, oh, you're a perfectionist, but not really. I'm just trying to get rid of something weird or whatever, because to me, you got to be loose. The Tom Petty thing, for instance, it turned out I played it in one take. Tom stood between the speakers, was bobbing his head and smiling when he listened down, turned around and goes, that's it. And then I said, well, do you have another track? And he said, yeah. I said, I'll do another take. And I always take that with me. I don't nitpick stuff like that. Otherwise, I've worked with people and it's well, let me take that section again. Let me take it 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 again. I'm not like that. In fact, when I'm working on stuff here myself, I might go through a section and then as soon as I don't like what I did, I just stop right then and I just start from there. And so I think I get to wear both sides of the hat. Once again, I keep using that phrase, but it's the idea that I know the notes I kind of want to aim for, but I'll never recite them the same way because I don't want to do that.
Is there a big parallel with working with someone like, say, Tom Petty than someone like Weird Al Yankovic?
Well, it's funny because Al, he straddles both sides. People might not realize this, but he's a brilliant musician, but he's also a brilliant musical mind. And it's not light for him, but it's fun. There's nothing goofy. He's very musical. And for him, I remember I could give him a lot of choices. And I'd say, you really want to go through those choices? And he's like, absolutely, I love it. And he is truly amazing like that because he's so musical. It's not just, the lyrics, which are great, but he really does care about all aspects of the music. And great story with Al. I had already worked with Tom and did a bunch of stuff with Bruce and a bunch of those kind of people. And my family, I have 2 sons, Devin and Julian, and back then they must have been about, 9 and 11 or 10 and 12, something like that. And they were always cool, Dad's got these cool gigs, whatever. But it was just kind of normal life. And I remember one day I came home and I went, guys, guess who I hung with today and worked with? And they went, who? Okay, whatever. And I said, Weird Al. And they stopped and they went, you worked with Weird Al? I said, yeah, you worked with Weird Al? And all of a sudden I got the most street cred in my entire life. And it's great.
That's suddenly cool now.
Yeah, it was a big shift in our life like that. What other gigs you got, Dad? So I always thank Al for that.
He's certainly not a one-trick pony. Oh, he's the comedy guy from an outsider who's not listened to the stuff. He's just the guy who does pastiches of well-known songs. But you listen to the stuff and you don't know what's coming next.
You really don't. And I just heard he was talking about how that happened. In fact, that's what the other guy said, that he knew me, the host, Ted Bonnet. He mentioned me to Al, and Al said, something, and he goes that I was saying how much it's about the music. And then Al just went off about how important the music is and his great band who's been with him forever. So I played on a couple of his records, and it's kind of cool. He's just a great guy.
So you mentioned earlier that you got so busy you kind of took your foot off the gas with performing live, but you did perform live with Bruce Springsteen in his Sessions band in 2006. How was that whole experience? And I was going to say what persuaded you to get back out there live, but it's a bit of a no-brainer.
Oh, yeah, it's Bruce, of course, In fact, I was just thinking about it because you being in the UK, that before my first son was born, I remember I was going to come to England. So this is 88, I was still just playing live. I was with Rosie Flores, and my wife went, okay, well, with you being gone on tour, now's the time. Let's have kids. So there's very romantic. So there's a little part of you here at home, blah, blah, blah. So I went to the UK, and when I came back, then my son was born, and then I said, I can't miss a minute of this. So I stopped going on the road. That kind of coincided with not playing live as much in general in town. So with Bruce, I remember I had to go back in the late 90s to play on a TV thing with him. We had already done The Ghost of Tom Joad. That record came out and all. So then I think I might have seen him when he was in town a little bit, but, not much. And then all of a sudden, he had the Sessions band, the Seeger Sessions band put together. And they were all these New Yorkers. And it was like, well, do you want to come out and join this thing? And it's like, well, yeah. What are you kidding? And I went out there, and these guys are still like my best friends. First, I didn't know what to expect. Oh, here's this guy, from California that already knew him and blah, blah, blah. And when I walked in, it was just nothing but love and hugs. And it was just there was no work. I mean, it was work in you want to get everything right. The songs, they seem simple, but the parts, everything can sort of got to really keep your eye on what's happening.
Is there a lot of rehearsals with Bruce, or is it kind of, I call it be ready or go home? Is it that kind of
It's more be ready. The rehearsals are, kind of, okay, let's throw this arrangement together. And, do a couple things. You don't know if it's going to get in the show. You don't know where in the show it might go. But yeah, you just have to keep your eye on him. And there would be times, I'm finished a solo, and then I realize he's all the way on the other side of the stage and never going to get back to the mic. And I just wait for him to throw his hand up like, take it again, And he'll tell the band, let's bring it down, and we'll bring it down. And we have no idea how it's going to come back up. But he's like the most perfect band leader that he can do this. And it's in front of 20,000 people, 30,000 people.
And how many people were in that band? That was a pretty busy lineup, right?
Yeah, I think maybe about 17. You had the horn section, you had a couple of violinists, fiddle, we'll call it fiddle for that, Sam and Susie, and then drums, bass, 3 background singers, his nephew Frank, Chocolate Genius, Patty, Charlie Giordano, he's been working with the E Street Band a lot, and then me. And it was kind of great because, I'd play a few different instruments in the show, and it's never a dull moment.
Was there any particular shows or countries that stand out on that tour? Did you come over to Dublin, Ireland?
We did. In fact, we shot the video there. Yeah. And that was great. That was the first time we were going to stay in a place long enough. So, my wife came out. She could finally, it was really nice. They just treat everybody so great. I will always fawn about how everybody who works with Bruce and, him, it starts with him. And so we did Dublin. We did a bunch in England, Sheffield, Manchester, London. We played Wembley Arena, that kind of thing. But my favorite spot, I think, was Verona in Italy. We played that Coliseum.
Very cool.
It really is. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous setting. If you could look it up, the Verona Coliseum, I think it was from 30 AD or something like that. And they turned it into this great venue. And he was so great because, Verona's the whole Shakespeare thing, Romeo and Juliet. So before we went on, he said at the last minute, hey, let's do Fire. We had never played Fire, the song Fire. And kind of went over the chords a little bit, in the background. Not really much. He just said, listen. So we did Fire that night. And then all of a sudden, he stops the band at the end of this chorus. And we're all kind of looking like, what's going on? And then all of a sudden he nods. And that's when the verse that goes, Romeo and Juliet. But the whole crowd sang it. And it was like chilling.
Almost like he knew that was what was going to happen at that moment.
Oh, he knew. He didn't tell him. He just nodded. It's just brilliance.
How do you find working with like bands compared to, because you did the Man of Steel soundtrack? How was that? Was you translating music which was already written and adding to it? What was that process?
No, that was kind of completely different. The Superman movie with Hans Zimmer was really Hans collecting sounds of steel guitars to use kind of like a sampler, like you would with a keyboard sampler that has violins and stuff. So there were 8 of us, I think, 8 steel players. And we would kind of just do things like hold notes, just play a C. So you'd get like 8 of this chimey steel guitar, C, and now play it with more vibrato and, now go D and now play it with more vibrato. And he would just collect the parts. And I remember the first day he wasn't there, Peter Asher was in charge of it at that time. And even he didn't quite know, I think, what was going to go on. It's like, okay, we're collecting notes from these guys, And the next day, Hans walks in. And, I never met him before. And I always thought Hans Zimmer, he was probably this proper composer and this and that. He walks in as like the jolliest guy in the world. I've never met anybody more happy. He goes, you all think I'm crazy, right? Well, check this out. And overnight, his guys had loaded in the samples. So he started just playing the keyboard and you hear this big, chimey, reverby steel guitar thing. And he would turn the mod wheel, which would add the vibrato or slides. And it was kind of great. So we had 3 days of that. But on the last day, he and I, just by ourselves, went through and we did a bunch of moves and stuff. So it was kind of cool. I got to work one-on-one with him.
Does that go down as perhaps one of the most unique projects you've done?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a couple very unique ones. That was unique in that it was so different, but we were treated so great. But all of the steel players could be together. I mean, we were all in the room together. I still call it's like summer camp, for a few days.
Trading off hints and tips.
Right. And some guys really love that. We always joke about when people start talking like that. But, it's kind of fun. And then in the next breath with somebody else, I might be talking about compressors and, recording gear and tape emulations and stuff. It's kind of a cool thing like that. And for session players, people don't realize it, but you have to be somewhat geeky when it comes to gear. Because even though they're wailing on these guitar solos, some great players, George Deering, Tim Pearson, all these great guitar players, but they know their gear inside and out. And so it's not like, just be Mr. Rockstar guy. It's like, I wonder what happens if I change the impedance on this thing,
How do you find creating music now as compared, let's use the term back in the day, because you spoke about working with Tom Petty, but I would imagine now, and it's more commonplace, especially this year, people have been recording at home and sending the parts in when they're asked to guest on an album, which I would imagine is quite commonplace now. Do you miss perhaps the studio camaraderie, or is it trade-off with convenience and speed?
Well, yeah, it depends on what it is. We all miss it. I work a lot over at Capitol. I did before this at Capitol Records, and there would always be, for these projects, all the musicians in there at the same time. And just great, great players. Ralph Humphrey on drums, Lee Sklar on bass, blah, blah, blah. And everybody's going through the same thing of, wow, this is so great to be in the same room together, because it has gone modular probably about 15 years ago, but certainly within the last 7 years. It's just really odd. A lot of the studios have closed. LA's a tough town to drive in. I know for me, I say to people, well, come to my place, and we can do it, as opposed to me having to drive to North Hollywood to their studio, because it can just take forever to get there. And so that part of the modularness is nice, because they'll come to me or whatever. And I remember doing an American Idol show, and the engineer and the producers just literally went to each guy's studio and collected their parts, because they knew getting everybody together was going to be impossible. And it worked out great.
As we mentioned earlier, I first saw you performing with Chris Shiflett on his Dead Peasants, All Hat and No Cattle material. How did you hook up with Chris originally? Did he seek you out, or is it interconnected with friends?
Well, yeah. Got me thinking. I think Greg, the fellow who played originally on his album, couldn't do stuff. And, we were friends, and he knew that, I guess he trusted me enough. So I'm assuming that's how Chris found me. And we had our first gig. I don't even remember if we rehearsed. Maybe we rehearsed once or something, but it was this big show, like a festival in Orange County called the Hootenanny. And I remember my son at the time, my youngest must have been about 17 at the time. But when he was in middle school, he was a crazy Foo Fighters fan, just insane Foo Fighters fan. So with Chris, he lives here on the west side too. He said, look, I'll pick up your gear and we'll drive down together. So I said, hey, can my son come along? He goes, oh yeah, that'll be great. He's got boys who are younger. And so my son comes along and here comes this Foo Fighter pulling up in a like Toyota minivan, not a Ferrari. This is a minivan, helping me carry my gear so that he could drive us. And he told my son these stories, because my son was asking about how did you make this record, this one. And so it was kind of great. We went to Santa Barbara together. I got to see some of their old, haunts. And they grew up in that whole skateboard world of, the punk skateboarders. And he's really smart. Chris is so well read. If you ever hear him really speak or write stuff, you can tell.
His podcast's great.
It is. And in fact, the whole Walking the Floor, when we were out, we were doing his record that was more country-tinged rock. Okay. I once played for him. I said, check this song out because I knew he wanted to learn about the old country music stuff. And being a steel player then, I know a bunch. I remember playing him an old George Jones song called The Grand Tour. And he went, what is that? And then the next thing you know, he's sending me YouTube videos of, old Ray Price.
He'd gone down the rabbit hole.
Oh, he dove in. He needed to understand the whole music and psychology behind it before he was going to do it. It was like learning. And of course, Walking the Floor is the name of his podcast. And that's the old Ernest Tubb song. That's where he got that from. And which is perfect.
When I saw you at those shows, it was actually at Amoeba Music was the first one. That's gone now, right?
They've moved. I don't know if the new one's opened yet. Right now, they probably wouldn't even be able to keep it open. But they did, we were all really upset that they were closing. But then we found out that they were moving.
So much character in that old building, though.
Oh, yeah. You obviously went there. And it's kind of great. You can look down over everybody. And that was kind of a special world. And playing there, that was kind of fun. Yeah, and just the fact that even Chris would do that. He'd be playing some stadium gig 2 weeks before. And next thing you know, we're on the Amoeba Records little stage while people are shopping.
At 3 p.m. on a Tuesday or whatever it was.
Only Chris.
Just the best. But you appear to have an absolute joy when you're performing. Do you miss that?
Yeah, well, you can tell. I can't even watch myself because I'm flailing. A lot of steel players are a little more stoic. And for me, my hands are flailing. I make kind of faces as I'm playing, of the notes I'm playing. And I think that shows the joy. I mean, any chance of playing anything, whatever it is, you got to dive in. Like you have to know music and then just go for it. One of the things, as a bass player, growing up playing bass, you play the root of, the heart of the chord. You're playing the heart of the downbeat.
Pretty much all I do.
No, thank you. That's what we all want. That makes the perfect bass player. But that you're playing that, you're on top of the chord, whatever it is, or the note, or the note in the chord you're going to play, whatever. And so that's how my mind was growing up. But playing steel, it's more of a reaction to everything that just happened in between those notes. Chord hits, the singer sings. How did they sing it? What did they say? What was the mood? What's the groove? And then you answer it. And that's kind of what I look at steel for, that ambience, but, usually around the vocal, not on the vocal, which is completely different than bass. And so it's kind of fun to do that. And that's where I get the joy is that kind of like, oh, that worked. And then the next line, what did they say? How did they say it? And what had I played that I can answer that makes sense with what they did? And then it just kind of happens.
Has there ever been a lure of Nashville for you?
No. I have a lot of friends that moved there, did great. Like I said, my studio is 4 blocks from my house. When I walk out of my home, if I turn right, I'm 4 blocks at the Santa Monica Beach. If I turn left, I'm 4 blocks to the studio. And there's just no way that I would ever think, and especially because I got to work with all these great players, and none of it was, not that Nashville was cookie cutter, but I didn't have to do that because I'd be playing with these artists that didn't want to use steel guitar for that pop country radio thing. They were using it to instill a mood or a vibe, that kind of thing. And I was just always gravitated to that more than moving back there.
Kind of in closing, is there kind of anything you miss from Hollywood and California 1978 when you first arrived?
Yeah, I think, it was post-hippie, but there was still a lot of that thinking. I think people were very, and I could be remembering it wrong, but it just felt like there was less get off my lawn attitude amongst people. I don't know. It wasn't odd for me to be living in my van. Now there's way too many people that have to do that, and it's just tragic. Back then, it was just this side of the surfer kind of VW van guys, It was just past that. And so it was different. And of course, the traffic, has gotten worse. The air had gotten better. I mean, this year was a little weird, but so some of that changed.
Do you remember the first bar or the first show you saw when you got here?
I do, and I know the fellow who played there, which was interesting. It was O'Mahony's, and it was a band called Hot Lips and Fingertips. My friend Ed Berghoff was there, and I didn't know them. But then, this is kind of interesting because you mentioned here Weird Al. My first gig, once again, I was a bass player at this point. My first gig was backing up an 8-year-old Elvis impersonator. And it was in this place, Palmdale, which is about 60 miles from L.A. or something like that. And I remember, I got like $25, and it was a lot of rehearsals and stuff, but it was my first gig. But the drummer on it is a guy named John Schwartz, who's Weird Al's drummer, John Bermuda Schwartz. So we've been friends, and there were many years I didn't see him. And then I ended up doing the Weird Al thing, and it's like, wow, here's John again. And it was, the first gig.
That's amazing. Everything interlinks and crosses over again eventually if you stick around long enough, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Marty, thanks ever so much.
My pleasure, Rob. You're great. And you just kind of like opened up the floodgates here. So
yeah, if you think of anything else, just let me know.
I'm not used to that, but I just feel so comfortable talking to you. And this is really awesome.
What are you working on at the moment?
You know what? Every day is kind of something different. I mean, now it's hard because I don't have anybody in the studio. So a lot of what I'm doing is mixing, mastering, different things. I also do a lot of sessions via the internet where, some of these artists need stuff and I'll do it. But to be honest with you, it's hard for me to ever sum it up because one day it's this person's project, the next day it's this one, the next day it's this one, and I don't even...
Do you ever get a chance to be a fan of music anymore?
Oh, absolutely. My hobby when I'm not working is music. So I love that a lot. My youngest, he actually goes by the name Pink Sock. The S is a $sign. And he does this kind of like sexy R&B-ish kind of thing. And so he's always turning me on to all this new music, that only people of that age, late 20s or mid-20s, they kind of find that we don't hear because, there's no radio or anything anymore. And so he's always turning me on to stuff like that.
Are you hearing samples of old stuff like, well, that's such and such?
Oh, absolutely. And I do get a lot of it from both of my kids because, I used to listen to a lot of music also for homework because I'd have to do it. But now there's none of that. We're just making records and so everything's free. So I take it wherever I can get these ideas of what to listen to. And so both my kids will turn me on to completely different things. And it's great. But also all of us isolated, we are all watching more Netflix, right? Are you guys watching more?
Far too much.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't watch it without having my Shazam button ready.
Right.
Because all of a sudden there'll be a scene in the background and I'll hear something and it's like, who is that? And as soon as Shazam tells me, I go down the rabbit hole of listening to everything that they do. And then I get back to the movie.
I love that you're still focused on enjoying the music as well as working on the music. That's great.
Oh, yeah. I think you have to, if you're going to do it, well, for me, because otherwise what I played wouldn't be as authentic if it was just purely like braining it.
Once it becomes a formula.
Yeah, then it's not going to work for yourself like that. So for me, it's like you have the left side of your brain, which is telling you the notes, how's the song go? What's it do? Whatever. Then the right side just is the same when you're playing. It should be the same as when you're just listening. And so fortunately, I'll try my hardest not to forget to do that.
Well, I'll let you go. Again, thank you ever so much. I've loved it.
Thank you, Rob.
How great was that? Marty was an absolute joy to talk to, and I had a lot of fun hearing all his great stories, and I think you can tell from the chat how much Marty is still in love with music. Once again, if you want to find out about all the other albums Marty has worked on, then please visit martyrifkin.com. I hope you all out there are doing okay and having fun listening to these talks. If it's someone you're perhaps not familiar with, then I hope they're insightful and you perhaps become a fan by the time they're done. I'm looking forward to sharing a lot more in the near future. Until then, please continue to share the good word by mentioning the Straight to Video podcast with your friends, and thank you all for the continued likes, shares and follows on social media. Anyone who is able to spare a couple of minutes to post a review on Apple Podcasts, that would really make my day, as that can really make a difference in getting the word out there. So I can't wait to speak to you all again very, very soon. You guys all look after yourselves.